Delighted to be here, and I'm delighted everyone came back after lunch as well, so that's always a bonus. We've had successful workshops so far, a lot of good talks this morning, and I'll do my very best to not bring that to a stuttering halt with this effort. As Karen said, I'm from the University of Stirling up in Scotland, and I don't know if you can see particularly clearly, we're quite an active group. We call ourselves Physiology, Exercise and Nutrition Research Group, and we like to practice what we preach. So this was actually just last week, up walking in the hills. It's not quite as bright and sunny as it is down here up north. But when the sun does come out, we do have this really beautiful campus. So if you've never been and you do get a chance to visit Stirling, I'd really recommend it. It's very, very scenic, and that's not actually Winterfell, that is actually Stirling as well. So right on the doorstep of University of Stirling, which is Scotland's University of Sporting Excellence, we've got Sport Scotland central office for the Scottish Institute of Sport. And the Institute of Sport has this remit, if you like, this mission statement, which is to deliver cutting-edge technology and innovation in order to provide specialist services to meet the needs of individual sports and athletes. So you can see, hopefully, how TMG potentially contributes towards that particular remit. And just to give you a little bit of background about the Institute, here's just a brief overview of some of the athletes that are currently supported or have been supported in recent years. And you can see a wide range of sports. You can imagine the unique demands on all these athletes across different sports. Very, very different set of skills required, very, very different series of support networks that are required as well. And the Institute was founded in 1998, and since then it's helped support 18 world champions, 36 Olympic and Paralympic gold medalists, 12 European gold medalists, and 69 Commonwealth Games medalists. So a fairly high success rate and a fairly high standard of athletes. So how does TMG fit into that? This is a little competition of who's the palest, by the way, going on here. TMG, we've already had a really nice summary of what the measurements are. Just to remind you, displacement, contraction time, they're probably the two most important, the two most stable, and the two most valuable measurements. I'm just going to draw your attention to another measurement that started to creep into the literature, into the research literature more recently, and that's a measurement of velocity. Now, effectively, velocity is just a function of contraction time and displacement. So it's the change in displacement over time. So it's a rate measurement as much as anything else. And some of the research is quite nice. This group, fronted by Irineu Leturco down in Brazil, do a lot of work with footballers. And they've shown that following high power, high strength, high speed training periods, training cycles, you get this quite pronounced change in the velocity measurement. In fact, I've highlighted that with a box. I don't even need to point at it. I've got this pronounced change in the velocity measurement, actually more marked than some of the other measurements like contraction time and displacement. So there is potentially value here. There's still a little bit of debate about the best way to calculate this velocity measurement. So some groups have looked at velocity over certain periods, breaking down the contraction into segments, if you like, so the first 10%, the 90% mark. One group that's, that's done some work with this showed quite a nice correlation here between a decrease in MVC and strength that was associated with fatigue following high intensity exercise, and the same sort of change in the velocity 10 measurement, so the initial onset velocity measurement. So there's some association there between what we're seeing in functional testing and what we're getting from this velocity measurement. But most of the literature actually relates to some of the more traditional parameters, if you like. And we've already seen some of this work from Sergey earlier, but this for me is one of the seminal papers from Bostjan Siminic's group. And it really followed on from a number of studies prior to this, but they showed quite clearly that there was this very, very strong prediction between contraction time and percent of, in this case, myosin heavy chain 1, but effectively fibre type composition. So you get this nice non-invasive assessment of muscle fibre type composition. So what does that do for an elite athlete population, for an institute of sport? Well, it allows us to make good recovery decisions. It allows us to make good training decisions. We know what our athletes are capable of because we know what kind of muscle they've got without having to go in invasively and remove chunks of muscle using muscle biopsies. In addition to that, we can get our muscle profiles done. So again, you've seen this kind of image already this morning, and we know that our blue, red, purple symbols are telling us whether we need to do more activation, more stretch, more strength-based training. Again, this allows for what I've referred to as targeted interventions. And effectively what this is all about is getting away from a one-size-fits-all approach. Because one size just doesn't fit all. We know that. We know that one size, what works for one athlete, does not necessarily work for another athlete. And yet, because of time constraints, because of difficulties in individualizing everybody's training, there will generally be a blanket training regime that's put over a squad on the whole. This allows us to focus that training in a way that might be more relevant to a particular individual. We can also use our TMG to assess our lateral symmetry, and apologies, these figures aren't particularly clear in this light, but again, you've already seen this kind of work already. How does symmetry come into our elite athlete population? Well, there's a fair amount of data to indicate that symmetry could be linked to injury risk. In terms of movement balance, we could be talking about gait patterns. This could have effect not just for injury and function, but actually for skill performance. Okay, from a biomechanical point of view, a kinetic point of view. As well as our lateral symmetry, we've also got our functional symmetry. So we could be looking antagonist-agonist ratios. We could be looking at the muscles within a synergist group and how those all coordinate with one another. Again, this could be linked to injury. Could also be linked to more efficient movement patterns. If we're trying to prevent injury, we're not always going to be able to. Sometimes we need to assess our rehabilitation process. So we can track this. Sergey again described this really nicely earlier, how TMG can be used to monitor that return to play action and monitor the effectiveness of a rehabilitation program. We've shown from our lab, just published last year, TMG can also track fatigue quite nicely. So being able to know when an athlete's fatigued, more importantly potentially when an athlete is recovered and when they should be returning to training, when they should be moving on to the next phase of their training, can be really, really important information for us going forward. So these are kind of the big, broad questions, I suppose, that we can answer with TMG. But before we do any of that, the first stage has to be to get our athlete profile. And again, you can always spot the Scot in the swimming pool quite easily. So how do we go about getting our athlete profile? Well, identify key muscles. In swimming, we're really interested in the whole body. So we get a snapshot of muscles from all across different regions of the body, mainly the prime movers. We collect these measurements and we build up our picture. So I've just shown a few here. And of course, by getting left and right, we also get this idea of symmetry. And we can see that balance in our individual. Now, different sports, different questions, different muscles are maybe going to be involved. I also do work with the Scottish hockey team. Of course, for hockey, there's not really any upper body element to it. We're really interested in everything from lower back, erector spinae, and southwards. So, potentially a more concentrated area of muscle profiling is going on there. Once we've collected all the data, all the profiles on our individuals within our squad, we can start to build up a picture of what that squad looks like. And we can look at where the mean of our squad lies, and we can see who's above the mean, who's below the mean, who's tighter, who's faster, who's slower. How do individuals compare to one another? This is particularly useful when we've then got new individuals coming into the program. We can screen them for the first time, and we know the level we want them to be at, because that's what we want our squad to look like. So again, it allows these targeted interventions from an early stage with a new athlete coming into the program. Now, where we work at Scottish Institute of Sport, quite often these athletes are students. So they're university students, 17, 18 years old, 16 in some cases. You're allowed to leave school at 16 in Scotland, if you know that. They're coming in very young. A lot of these guys have never done any structured S&C. They're high-performing athletes for their age, of course. They're coming into an elite athlete performance program, but they've never really had the kind of support that they would get at Sport Scotland. And an S&C program, you're almost starting from a blank sheet, which is a really exciting place to be. But if you don't know how to direct that athlete, you just kind of throw things at them and see what sticks. Using the TMG, we can actually plan from a very early stage what does this athlete need to work on? What areas do we need to try and tone up? What areas do we need to speed up? Where might they be lacking in power? How can we change that? We can also then look at comparing different individuals within their squad, and it might be done by position. So within our hockey, we can look at our defenders, midfielders, forwards. We don't bother with goalkeepers, they don't do anything. Within swimming, it might be different events, might be different disciplines. You can apply this to any sport. You know, it depends what you're interested in. We can then look at them all on top of each other. So we can see that generally, this is displacement here on the x-axis, on the y-axis, sorry, and our forward players generally have greater muscle tone in most muscles than our midfielders or defenders. Why is that? Are they faster? Do they do more running? Do they have more accelerations during the match? Are they stronger? Why would that be? Actually, are our midfielders and our defenders just not as well conditioned as our forwards, and we need them to be? So we can start to put a context around these measurements as well and start to answer some bigger questions about how our squad is made up. And of course, Sergey showed the database that exists of different athletes, different sports, and we can compare our squad to the database. So we've got the left and right side shown in blue and red. We've got the database shown in white. And what we can see from our squad is that generally down posterior chain here, most of the muscles are more toned than the database. Not so much on the anterior. Why is that? Is that something that's a problem? Is that something we need to look at to try and solve? Or actually, is that something that's desirable? And again, we contextualize it. We do a lot of work on the posterior chain in terms of muscle tone, in terms of strengthening, trying to avoid hamstring injuries. So potentially that makes sense, and that's actually something desirable. So if we get athletes that are very close to the norm, we might actually want them to be closer to our squad norm rather than the database norm. Could be the other way around. So using both databases, our own squad and the existing database that's built into the software, can be really, really useful. Now, we've talked a little bit about reliability and validity. I just want to highlight this one paper by a good friend of mine, Max de Troilo, and some other colleagues from up in Stirling helped on this paper. And what they showed was that the reliability of TNG has actually improved somewhat in an exercised or fatigued state versus a rested state. Now, the caveat to that is that the exercise was a series of MVCs, isometric, and the fatigue was electrically induced fatigue on a single muscle. So generally, when we're training, when we're competing as athletes, we're not going to have that kind of rigorous control over the way that the muscle is exercised or the way the muscle is fatigued. We're not going to get that uniform a response. But what we know is that we will get fluctuations depending on rested, fatigued, exercised. So when we're building up our profile to try and get a baseline, if you like, it's no good just to have a single measurement. So when we get our athletes in, what we do is measure left and right on our muscle. We get a second measurement and a third measurement. And the way that we did this was 3 consecutive weeks. So the same time of day, same laboratory conditions, tried to keep external variables as controlled as possible. The only variable we didn't control was, well, what training had they done? They'd trained, and it was the same time relative to that training, but actually the training loads, training volume, had been different because they don't do the same thing week after week after week, day after day after day. And we get that across all our muscles, and we can start to build up this picture where our vastus lateralis here is pretty consistent. There's not really much fluctuation at all. If we look at bicep femoris, on the other hand, I mean, that's all over the place. You know, that's responding clearly very, very differently from week to week to week, depending on the training loads that have been done. We then get, we then get the latissimus dorsi down here, where generally we've got good clustering and we have one kind of flyaway measure. Now, is that an outlier? Was there an issue there? Was there potentially an injury coming into play when that measurement was done? Well, we need to know that that muscle can range down to as low as that. And it may be that it was injured, but actually it can go that way. And there was no complaints from the athlete. There was nothing in terms of time off training or anything that was required like that, or physio treatment or rehabilitation. So we have to consider that as a potential normal value for that individual. So once we've got all our measurements, we can then build up a mean and a range. And the range that we use is for this with coefficient of variation. So sometimes called the relative standard deviation. And it just seemed to work quite well in terms of giving an appropriate sized range for us to work with. It wasn't too large that actually you're never ever going to fall outside of it, and it wasn't too narrow that you can fluctuate outside of that quite easily. So I've put the question up there of what would cause an individual to fall outside of their normal range, and we did this fun little experiment here. So we had one of our swimmers, did his training session, tested pre and post. You can see there not very much change. There's not been much of an effect of that training session. So the take-home message is that I clearly worked much, much harder than the swimmer because I've had a much more of an effect. But really, someone who's well conditioned and well accustomed to this kind of exercise isn't going to fluctuate an awful lot just on the back of training. And, Sergey touched on this point earlier. So we wouldn't expect to see massive changes just day to day because they've trained. Maybe in the aftermath, maybe if it's exhaustive, maybe if it's too fatigued, maybe certain phases in training, but your normal day-to-day loading wouldn't expect to see too much. Whereas in your slightly less well-conditioned individual over here, there's a drastic change in the properties of that muscle following the training. So we went on next to track our athletes over a slightly longer period of time, and this time we used 3 days in a row. And we got them before and after every training session. So we ended up with about 11 or 12 measurements. So it's two training sessions most days, one on some of the days. And you can just make out, hopefully, the dotted black line is the mean, and then our range is the 2 dotted grey lines. To tidy that up, I'm actually going to remove all the measurements that were within the normal range. And we're left with these 4. So why were these 4 outside normal range? Well, we can highlight the 2 at the top, and we can see that these were both before training, AM, first thing in the morning. Effectively, just rolled out of bed, driven to the swimming pool and got tested. So his displacement was low, his muscle tone was low first thing in the morning. He hadn't done any exercise, hadn't done any warm-up, hadn't done any kind of priming. This is just evidence, if ever there was needed, that you shouldn't just go into a training session cold. You need to do some kind of stretching-based, land-based warm-up in order to prime your muscles for the activity. Now over here, we've got 2 where the contraction time or the velocity is slightly faster. Displacement's actually within our normal range. These 2, both pre-training as well, but afternoon this time. So quite well rested. It wasn't after training. The training had been hours earlier. This was afternoon. One of the times, actually, he didn't have training that afternoon, but before going in. This starts to build up a picture of how the muscle changes across the course of a day, and we can start to schedule in when would be the best time to perform certain types of training. It's going to be good for him to train there because his displacement is optimal, it's within his range, and his contraction time is fast. His velocity is fast. So that's going to be a great time for him to go in and perform quite well. First thing in the morning, not so much, until he's done his warm-up, until he's done some priming to activate those muscles. And probably more important than training, arguably, is competition. We can do the same sort of thing. We can track across competition, in this case a swimming race. And we get our pre and post warm-up measures, and actually there's not been an awful lot of change there. So again, similar to what we saw a couple of slides ago with the training, we didn't get an awful lot of change in the muscle as a result of a training session, and similarly the warm-up hasn't made a huge change in the muscle. This isn't fresh out of bed, this is actually in the middle of a competition. Post-race, we've got this massive, massive reduction in displacement, a tightening of the muscle. Clearly the high intensity activity that's gone on there, the fast racing, has resulted in this fatigue, this stiffening of the muscle. And then we get our post-warm down measure. We can see that we've returned somewhat towards our baseline measure, but not the whole way. So it begs the question, has the warm down not been effective? Has it not done its job? Do we not want that muscle getting right back up to here? Not necessarily. He's not racing again straight after this warm down. He's going to go away and recover. So actually that might just be the catalyst that starts the recovery, and then after the time that he takes away from the pool in the hotel before returning for the final in the evening, that might be sufficient. Or it might be that the warm down's not been effective enough. It might be that the warm down has been effective because actually this whole range is acceptable for a muscle. And again, we're getting away from this individual point. So what we can start to build up is an idea of a slightly larger range for each muscle, a range that we expect the muscle to be able to function properly in order to aid performance. And we can see that some muscles have far narrower ranges than others. And generally, the muscles that have higher displacement are going to have a wider range. We can also see here, I've picked these two on purpose, we've got one who's more or less fairly symmetrical, although the ranges are slightly different. The means there are about the same, and one that's a bit more asymmetrical. But we've got these ranges, we want our individuals to fall within, and every measurement we do can contribute towards what you see here. We can fine-tune these ranges and hone them down, because every normal measurement we get, every measurement where the function is fine and the performance is acceptable, can be built into this model to fine-tune and make those ranges more accurate. So we can track different muscles, of course, and not every muscle responds exactly the same way to exactly the same load. So here we have our same time points of our race, our pre-warm-up, post-warm-up, post-race is here, and then our post-warm-down. And we can see we've got the vastus lateralis and the gastrocnemius medialis at the top and the bottom respond more or less the same way. We get this dip post-race in both cases. Bicep femoris, we don't get that same response. We get a very different shape to the response across the time of the event. It makes sense when you think about it. The different skills that are being performed are not going to make the same demand on every muscle in the same way. So actually treating every muscle group, every area and compartment of the body in the same way when you warm up is going to be completely inadequate. The warm-up strategy has to reflect the fact that muscles are going to respond differently to the same exercise because the muscles aren't contributing exactly the same thing to that exercise. And further than that, we can actually see same muscle on different sides of the body, so we've got the right side in orange and the left side in blue, don't even respond the same. So this is across a whole weekend of racing, and generally the dips that you see here are post-race. And we can see here in particular, we've got the right side seems to have fatigued a great deal, and the left side not so much. So why would that be? If we go back to our kind of profile, we can see that the left side here has a bigger range than the right side. So why would one side have greater variability, a wider range than the other side? Is this muscle impaired in some way? Is it inferior? Is it not as strong? Is it having to work much, much harder each time just to keep up with what its twin on the right-hand side is doing, and therefore the stress that it's put through during the task is much greater? That could well be the case. If we were to balance the strength of these muscles on each side, would they respond in a more similar fashion during the race? Or actually, is it the technique that's the issue? Is it a technique that's involved in this race that's very, very dominant and uses the right-hand side to a much greater extent than the left-hand side? And so there's a number of different questions to be answered here, and again, it all comes down to context and looking at the individual and how they respond. My first inclination when I saw this was, what side did you breathe to? Freestyle swimmer. Breathe to both sides, right? That doesn't help. So we start to ask these questions, we start to try and piece together our jigsaw and work out why we're getting these different responses until we hopefully narrow down, probably won't be one reason, but the multiple reasons why we're getting these. So in terms of asymmetry, these are some early data, so they're not quite up to date, but from our elite swimmers up in Scotland. And you can see that these are high-performing athletes, but there's high levels of asymmetry. So this is actually flipped around from what Sergey was showing you earlier, in that this is asymmetry rather than symmetry we're assessing, so a higher value is worse. So what we're looking for is 0% being perfectly symmetrical, perfectly the same. Now, some work that I did in the lab showed that individuals who are asymmetric based on force, so this was a isometric knee extension, NVC, were more likely to have at least one muscle within that muscle group that was asymmetric. And in this case, the rectus femoris is where we have a significant difference. That probably is coincidental. It could be any muscle. And actually, if we start to look here, although there's no statistical significance, you know, from a qualitative point of view, we could probably say that symmetry is looking slightly more likely in all three of these muscles in this case. So can we do anything about that? Well, here's a little case study we did. One athlete, high levels of asymmetry. We were just really interested in lower body at this stage. So we assessed that asymmetry, and then I really passed it on to the S&C coach. my job was done to an extent. They put together a program that was designed to try and reduce asymmetry. I'm avoiding saying the word improve symmetry. They were trying to reduce asymmetry. 6 months later, we measured again. Looks like a decent improvement. 4 months later, we measured again, and well, we've kind of plateaued a little bit with a couple of muscles. We've shown a further improvement on the hamstring there. We completed the 12 months with a further study, a further measure 2 months later, and we can see from start to finish a marked reduction in asymmetry across all 3 of those muscles. So I know what you're thinking. The big question is, well, does that affect performance? And I have no idea, to be perfectly honest. All right, it could do, it could not. We can't really confirm that there's a direct correlation between reducing this asymmetry and making someone perform better. But what we can do is try to reduce our asymmetry and then look at other markers that potentially could contribute to our performance. So we can look at reduced asymmetry. Does it make them stronger? Reduced asymmetry, does it make them faster? Does it make their skill performance better? And all of these can then be pieced together to, okay, those all contribute to performance, so therefore surely reducing asymmetry will lead to an increase in performance. The other thing we can do is compare different individuals. So here we have 2 hockey players, both forwards, both very similar style of player, very similar in a number of ways. We've got one who's quite highly asymmetric, hopefully you can see from the figure there, and one who actually has quite good symmetry across the board. Is one athlete more susceptible to injury than the other? Does one athlete suffer from fatigue more readily than the other? Does one athlete perform better on metrics of power, speed, strength than the other? These are the kind of questions more longitudinally that we can start to answer without having to actually intervene to try and change this athlete's symmetry. We can compare similar athletes who show different kinds of muscle profiles. Now, all of that being said, there's a bit of an elephant in the room here, and it would be remiss of me not to draw attention to this paper that came out just a couple of days ago. And they claim that TMG is not sensitive for monitoring muscle fatigue in elite youth athletes. I've just spent half an hour or so telling you about how we use it to assess fatigue and symmetry and all kinds in elite athletes. What they did here was use counter movement jump as their marker of fatigue. And they used the TMG measurements. They used velocity that I described at the start. They used displacement. And they showed that although there was a decrease in counter movement jump, there was no change in the TMG parameters. So they dismissed TMG as being sensitive enough to track fatigue. But how many components are there to a counter movement jump? How many muscles, how many joints are used? How much central contribution is there to the performance of a counter movement jump? So because there was no sign of fatigue in the periphery of individual muscles as assessed by TMG, there may have been fatigue elsewhere, and that was what the counter movement jump was picking up. So I guess the point is that there's a limitation, and we should be aware of that. But that limitation doesn't have to be limiting. It can be a strength. The TMG can tell us what a counter movement jump can't, because it can tell us about the individual muscle at the periphery in isolation. Counter movement jump can just tell us about the whole body, how fatigued is it. We can locate specific areas of fatigue using TMG. So there's a whole host of people that I really need to thank, but I suppose special mention Dr. Angus Hunter, Dr. Malcolm Fairweather from University of Stirling and Sport Scotland respectively, Scottish Swimming, Scottish Hockey. Very grateful to the access that they've allowed me to work with their athletes and with the support staff that go along with them. Finally, thank you all for listening. If you've enjoyed it, please go and tweet all about it, because I love a bit of social media. And if there's any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them now. Thank you. Yeah.
Nice presentation. Just question about the reduction in asymmetry that you was looking at.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that reduction was brought about by an improvement in a muscle, in the weaker of the two muscles.
As opposed to trying to make the other one worse.
Yeah.
Well, that was the idea anyway. So, I kind of joked that was my job done, the assessment, and pass it over to an extent it was. I wasn't heavily involved in actually what's the S&C that's going on here. because that was just the nature of the way we were doing it. But yeah, it was generally around using eccentric overloading on the weaker side to target the weaker muscles and the less well-toned muscles in order to try and bring that balance more in line, rather than neglecting the one side that was potential. But then that being said, Sergey kind of touched on it with displacement. It's not necessarily a case of lower and therefore higher muscle tone is better. Actually, there's an optimal range. So with the speed measurements, we want to just as fast as we can, but with displacement, it may be that actually in some cases asymmetry comes about because it's very tight on one side as opposed to undertoned on the other side. So it may be that, more stretching, but in this particular case, it was about trying to strengthen the muscles.
Okay. So another point, I quite like the part about the asymmetry, and I was wondering if they do a trap start, which I guess they do rather than a drop start nowadays, which is their leading leg and which is their back leg.
Yeah, so that's a good point as well, and that was right from the start. That was one of the things I went in with quite a strong interest in was their start performance, and actually a lot of the S&C stuff, that side of things is really about the first 15% of the race, if even that. It's the start and the underwater phase and the breakout, and so that was part of our sort of interest and looking at that. Generally, probably over time, you do end up with this, imbalance of sorts, especially down kind of plantar flexor, dorsiflexor region because of a track start, and actually you're very much predominantly using one leg. In terms of how they respond post-race, probably not so much because it's one dive and then that's it, and actually there's not an awful lot of effect there probably, but in terms of longitudinally and chronically building that up. So the question then becomes, well, actually, would we want to change that asymmetry? Would we want to reduce that? And that's probably, what your next question was going to be, and I've beaten you to the punch. And that, that probably with hockey is another example where it's actually a very unilateral sport to a degree. Now, we're only really focusing lower body, so to an extent you want to be fairly well balanced lower body, but upper body and even erector spinae that we do look at, you may not particularly expect that to be symmetrical because you spend most of your time in that position, not that position. So, tennis would be another great example. And, Rafa Nadal's probably the pin-up boy for asymmetry in terms of the difference between his left and right arms. Would it be advantageous for him to be symmetrical in the upper body? Not really, because actually he's left-handed and he does pretty much everything with his left hand. Kayaking, canoe slalom, these are other sports that we see a fair bit of work with asymmetry that's been done in these sports, and it's not necessarily advantageous to be well balanced from a performance point of view. From an injury point of view, when you bring the physio into the room, they want it to be as balanced as possible because you're going to get improved gait, you're going to get improved posture, and you're going to be less susceptible to injury. So there's this balancing act of, well, we want them to perform as well as we can, and that maybe means that they need to be asymmetrical. But actually, from a health and a postural and a gait and an injury prevention point of view, everything wants to be balanced, everything wants to be symmetrical. So, it is a fine line, and again, it comes down to context. It comes down to what's your requirements and what you want. This is probably the longest answer to a single question ever, but sorry about that. If anyone else wants any questions, I'll be back tomorrow. The other element is, these athletes, some of them are very, very high level, top performing, world champions in some cases. We've got, I'm not going to name names, but we had a world champion swimmer coming late in his career, towards the end of his career. Do we want to make any changes to that guy? He's a world champion and he's probably only got about a couple of years tops left of his career. Do we want to go in and start trying to change symmetry? Because he's made it that far as he is. He's found a way to be that swimmer, that good, with the asymmetries that exist. So probably what we want to do actually in an ideal world, rather than try to correct asymmetries like the case study that I show you, is we want to try and prevent them before they start. So when we get our young swimmers in, or our young athletes in, and we assess them and we look at where they are relative to the rest of the squad, we want to be targeting progression in a symmetrical fashion rather than trying to let those asymmetries develop. Asymmetries are probably much more prevalent in elite populations than everyday general population because they're performing high training loads that are putting certain demands and certain stresses on the body that are likely to result in these asymmetries. Whereas day to day, I probably don't do that much. It's going to make me asymmetrical. You know, occasionally walk sideways, but that's just for fun. You know, so generally, you're going to get more asymmetry in an athletic population. So can you target it at an earlier stage and try and prevent that if you think it's desirable to? So that's, as I say, probably the longest answer you've ever had. I don't think I even answered a question. So that's pretty impressive. But thanks, though.
It's quite long what we're going to talk about later.
Well, that's great. Yeah, Tom.
Thanks. Forgive me if I've missed something there, sorry. With measure of displacement.
Yep.
So what specific physical quality does that represent? I know we're saying muscle tone, but actual physical quality, what is that indicative of? Can you say that with any confidence?
So, yes, so effective muscle stiffness, muscle tightness. You could link that to force. You know, it's slightly tentative. So a muscle that is lower displacement, tighter, stiffer, should be able to produce more force.
And is there data to demonstrate that?
There, I think, is. I don't want to go out on a limb and try to name some because I can't think off the top of my head. But you know, I mean, certainly, it comes down to the same issue as the paper that I just showed at the end there. That how do you measure force of a single muscle? So you measure force, and actually, what you're getting is, you know, around the joint, multiple agonists, antagonist coactivation probably kicking in as well. You know, the synergy of those muscles is what's contributing to that force action, as well as the longitudinal transmission around the joint. And yet, we're just measuring a single muscle in isolation using TMG. So maybe if we get the displacement and the tone across all those muscles, we can then kind of stretch it out to look at muscle force, but still there's then central and voluntary elements of that force production. So you know, it's very, very difficult, and you know, to try and say it exactly. All I would say is tighter muscle should produce more force. So that's really as good an answer as I can give you, I'm afraid.
With the central and peripheral
Yep.
argument as well, like that contributes to force production. Is there any research still looking at TMG measures like displacement alongside like TMS measures? So doing voluntary force?
It's a great idea. Thanks. No, yeah, I mean, it is something. I mean, as you may know, we've got TMS up in Stirling as well. We've started doing some work around that, and it is something that's kind of started playing around in the back of my mind. Is looking at that, you know, looking at peripheral nerve stim as well, and getting whole muscle group activation, but at the periphery, getting the central activation from the TMS, and looking at the central pathway, and looking at the TMG, so isolating the periphery and trying to build up this picture. And you know, I'm not going to give away too much because someone will steal my idea and do the study before me, but you know, that's something that I'm, you know, certainly thinking along the lines of, and you know, it's great that I'm not barking up the wrong tree because someone else has got the same idea. So thanks for that.
Sorry,
Yeah,
just
okay.
to clarify, so a lower displacement score is associated with a higher force, but
To an extent. So in terms of an optimal, I would say maybe rather than a lower. That probably, yeah, I probably said that wrong. So an optimal displacement. So within the optimal range towards the lower end, you'd expect probably slightly higher force than towards the upper end. But as you say, with fatigue, you actually get just an impaired contraction. So the ability of the muscle to contract, the kind of EC coupling processes are impaired, and actually the contraction is just not going to go as far. So if we're outside our range above or below, then we're probably going to end up with you know, a weaker potential muscle. And if you remember the ranges I put up, you know, so above or below that range is undesirable. So it's not just a case of, well, there's a displacement, and if they're above that, no, we're not happy. It's actually if they're above or below, if they're outside it, either way, we want to try and bring that back into line. So yeah, so I kind of didn't make that point very well, but thanks for asking that, so I got the chance to clear it up. You look like you've got a supplementary question there. I'm just,
you still don't know what it's measuring, because if you say it's a measure of stiffness,
Mhm.
then it goes down with fatigue, but it's associated with force, it just all seems a bit kind of...
Yeah, so I mean, you know, it is kind of the optimal range of the optimal stiffness of the muscle is going to be associated with force. Yeah. So I mean, I guess the best way to probably think of it is in terms of sort of force length tension relationship would be the same kind of thing. So you know, if the muscle's stretched too long and you don't get enough cross bridge overlaps, then actually you're not going to produce much force. But similarly, if you're too short a muscle length, you're not going to produce much force either. So it's the same kind of idea. You know, we can kind of link it to that. And some work we did, well, I say we, it was before I arrived, but some work that was done up in the labs at Stirling looked at altering muscle length by changing knee angle and measuring displacement. And yeah, you know, it's as you would expect, a more optimal, what would be expected to be a more optimal knee angle, you get the best displacement response in terms of it not being too loose, too tight, it being nice and optimal in there. So yeah, so I would say that I would expect force to increase as displacement decreases down to a certain point, and then you can't, you know, you're almost getting your kind of inverted U of your optimal there. So once it starts to get too tight, your force starts to drop off again, if that makes sense.
I think the problem here is trying to quantify something in an absolute way and in an isolationist way. At the end of the day, it's not just about the force, but the coordinated output.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what I'm getting from this. And one of the things that was missing today so far was what Max presented in Dublin, which was, I tried to explain this in the hall earlier, and that was the return to the normal curve after about 6 days, which I thought was really interesting. You're trying to work with elite athletes and optimise training days and recovery, and that it took, I don't know which paper it was, but there was a study, and I think they had about 10 days of monitoring after intensive exercise, and it took at least about 6 days for the characteristics to come back to normal. Now, when you say, well, what is that? Is it force? I don't think it means force necessarily. I think it means that the muscle can now work optimally again, which doesn't necessarily mean just a peak force, but a coordinated effort with the rest of the chain.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the potential of the muscle to produce force would maybe be a better way of looking at it, or to contribute towards force production would be a better way to look at it. So yeah, it's how much force generation can come from that muscle in its current state as part of the wider system that is generating force externally. So yeah, it's, as you say, it's looking at force as being something that's systemic and an isolated muscle measurement here. So that kind of, well, it contributes part of that, but actually it's not the whole, you know. And very similar to kind of the idea of the symmetry and performance. Well, it may contribute part of that, but actually, you know, you can't say that it's having a massive effect on the whole, because we just don't know. There's too many parts involved there in contributing to what we're actually measuring, be that force as the end outcome. So yeah, it's still, you know, it would be brilliant for someone to publish a direct correlation between displacement and force, or even change in displacement and change in force production. You know, that would be brilliant. It's not been done so far, and it's difficult to do for, you know, reasons we've kind of highlighted and discussed there, because you just can't isolate force production. And, you know, Tom's idea of, well, let's isolate central mechanisms as well, and let's isolate other mechanisms and look at all the mechanisms in isolation against the final end output. And that might be the way to go. So then, you know, that might clarify what we're trying to get here. No? Awesome. Thank you.